First there was the Terminator. Then there was Terminator 2, Judgment Day. Then there was Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. Then there was Terminator Salvation and Terminator Genesis. Now there is Terminator Dark Fate. Not really sure what that means, but it's a better title than Genesis with the Y. Yeah. My thoughts on this movie are really mixed, because I'm a pretty hardcore Terminator fan. And I gotta say, I don't really like the direction the series has been going as of late. And I'm going to just run through my thoughts on the other movies right quick so you can get a sense of where I stand and where I'm coming from. I hope you can see where I'm coming from. The Terminator. Really cool film. That's a really cool film. It's so classic. There's something like special about that film. There's stuff in that film that's I don't know, it's really sci-fi, but it's really emotional. It's a really cool story. It's a really cool premise. I think it's executed really well. I think Kyle Reese is a really cool character. Sarah Connor is really good in The Terminator. I think she's actually kind of underrated in the first movie, because that's a movie where you really get to see her complete a character arc, you know, no, that's not entirely true. She does have a character arc in Terminator 2 for sure. But the arc of going from ordinary, normal girl to a badass, that's mainly done in the first movie. By the second film, she's pretty much a badass. I kind of, when I saw the Terminator Genesis trailer, I kind of didn't like how they basically dismissed Sarah Connor in the first film as like, oh, she'll be weak and feeble when you see her, but not anymore. Yeah, like, weak and feeble? No, she was just a normal human being, like anyone else, who didn't expect a fucking machine from the future to come and try to kill her. But she adapted pretty quick, you must admit, okay? So, Terminator 2... that's got to be the best one. That's why I have the Blu-ray. I would have the Blu-rays of the other films, but I'm kind of a poor man at the moment, I'm afraid. But Terminator 2, that's just fucking awesome. That's an awesome film. Yeah, it's one of the greatest action films ever. So, Terminator 2, awesome movie. Best in the franchise. Lot of great scenes in that. Sarah Connor's great in that. John Connor's great. Arnold gets much more of a role in that movie. T-1000 is great. Yeah, just so many good parts of that movie. Really long, but it builds. It really builds through it. Terminator 3, definitely not as good as the first two. But I do think it has some parts of it that have merit. I like that John Connor's an adult. I like that. I like that it introduces Kate Connor. I seem to remember the woman playing Kate Connor as being pretty good, actually. Nick Stahl, not really the best as John Connor. Okay, so this is official, like we're getting into spoilers here. This is for people who are already kind of fans or they don't care about spoilers. But anyway, I like that Judgment Day actually occurs. Yeah, Terminator 3 definitely not the best, but I don't think it's as bad as people really think. It's not as bad as like Phantom Menace or something. I know that's not saying much, but yeah. Terminator Salvation. Terminator Salvation is the worst in the franchise, in my opinion. But on the other hand, I respect it for certain reasons. Mainly, it is the only film in the franchise that tries something different than the traveling back in time shit. After 3 fucking movies, you get kind of sick of them going back in time over and fucking over. Terminator 1 was the first one. Okay, so that's different. Terminator 2 does something totally different with it because the machine is now the protector. That's really cool. Terminator 3 does kind of the same thing. It's, one of the liquid ones is coming and, the older model has to protect them. There's not really anything too different aside from the characters being protected in that movie. Terminator 4 pretty much, succeeds Judgment Day, though, and it takes us into the war. I thought it was a terrible fucking decision in Terminator 5 to go back in fucking time. You know what the best part of fucking Terminator 5 was? Terminator Genesis? It was the first 15 minutes of the movie where they were in the fucking future. They should have never fucking gone back in time. Okay? That's my problem with it. Terminator Genesis is... and that movie, I think it's technically better than Terminator 3 and 4 as a movie unto itself, I guess. It's not really good, but I think it's technically better than 3 and 4, but I think that it frustrates me. It really frustrates me because we're going back to the past again, It's like Terminator Salvation, for all of its flaws, and there are many, it still at least had the balls to go into the future and progress the story and expand the universe as a good sequel should. Okay? Now we're going back to the fucking past? That shit happened! We did this same fucking shit in 3 movies already. What the fuck? Come on, man. And it's such a soft reboot, people were all saying, is this a sequel? Is this a reboot? Is it a remake? And it's kind of all 3. I like to think of it as a sequel because if I have to choose between sequels, reboots, and remakes, I personally prefer sequels. Not that sequels are very good either, typically, but at least a sequel is progressing the story. I guess, I don't know, reboots and remakes are pretty similar. I don't know, they're both pretty bad because reboots, you've got an already established franchise, and then you're putting it back to the start. And you're not necessarily telling the same exact story, but you're kind of going back and telling it in a similar manner, but not quite. Whereas a remake, you're pretty much just telling the same story. So I guess I would rank it like sequel, reboot, and then remake. Remakes, I think, rarely have any reason to exist, especially if it's like a classic movie, which is usually what you're going to remake because people are going to remember the classics, right? If it's a great movie, you're rarely going to improve on it, so why do it at all? And this is a common theme that I'm going to touch on in this video, is I really don't like remake culture. I don't like all the Disney live-action movies that are coming out. I don't really see any reason for them to exist. But at the same time, I've learned that you've got to hold out judgment on these things. You can't just automatically assume that it's going to be a bad movie because it's based on a prior source material. I understand that. Nonetheless, I do have a wish that Hollywood would just have some more original ideas, or if you're gonna draw on a source material, I like sequels better because at least then it's not the same thing we got. You're moving on from that. You're building the house up, And this Terminator 6 movie, Dark Fate, I have worry about it because it seems like they're taking steps back. And for some people, that's going to be great because they despise Terminator 3, 4, and 5. And there are good reasons to despise those movies, don't get me wrong. The problem is, the problem that I see there is that I would rather them go on past those movies and keep continuing the story forward, kind of try to improve on what's been done with the newer films. It's like you can have bad episodes of a show, right? And that doesn't mean that you have to completely ignore those episodes' existence if you're going to continue the show forward, right? You acknowledge your mistakes and you move on. Now, let's get something clear here. James Cameron is not writing this movie. He's not directing this movie, okay? And there were multiple writers on Terminator 1 and 2. They're not writing it either. So this movie has completely different writers than the first two, and it has completely different director than the first two. James Cameron apparently provided some story, and he provided, he was working as a producer on it, okay? Well, I don't really think that's the same thing as being the writer and director, you know? So, the whole idea that this is the official Terminator 3, not like that other trash movie, I don't really see that. Yeah, okay, so James Cameron is working in it in some capacity, but he doesn't have near the involvement as he did in the first two. And as far as the whole idea about it being on an alternate timeline, and kind of whisking away the other three movies, it's not that those three movies are good. I agree, they're generally like bad movies, but there's some worth to them. There are important story elements, and there's stuff that I think they did good in those movies. This touches on a broader note that I want to get to in this video. Mainly that what I think a good sequel needs to do is expand on its universe, okay? It needs to take the series in a place that it hasn't gone before, in some capacity. That doesn't have to be physical or temporal or whatever, but in some way it has to expand upon it. Okay, Terminator 2 did this really effectively. Okay, Terminator 2, yeah, it doesn't get rid of the whole time traveling element, but it does it in a very different way, and it introduces a totally new machine. And it seems that, to me, we've largely backtracked and gotten away from something that I really loved about the Terminator franchise. What I really loved about the Terminator franchise was that it's a time travel story which, for the first 4 entries, it was told in a linear fashion. That's what I really liked about it. There were flash forwards to the future on occasion, mainly the intros, but for the most part, it's told in a linear fashion. You start off in '84, and you see Kyle Reese and the Terminator coming out of their bubbles, their time travel bubbles, and you see the time travel, the end result of it occur, but you don't actually see into the future where they're time traveling back. In fact, you don't see that until Terminator Genesis, right? And so, and then in Terminator 2, we progress further. We get into the 90s, 95, I think, in the timeline of the movie, which was a little bit after it occurred. There are little Easter eggs you can find in the movies that give you a sense of the exact year it is. Terminator 3, 2004, I believe. Again, I think that was a year after the movie was released. Again, you're catching up to like Judgment Day. And in Terminator Salvation, there's a really interesting dynamic that I thought was really cool. See, in Terminator is largely about prophecies of what's to come. That's what I think is one of the real strengths of the franchise. It's kind of like if you read a book and then you watch the movie, and you can kind of compare it and see how your conception of the characters align with the movie. And sometimes that's bad, and that's a different subject. But in the Terminator films, you rarely see the future. There are a few flash forwards into the future, but for the most part, you essentially only get conceptions of the events to come from descriptions of other characters in the franchise. Kyle Reese, the T-800 in Terminator 2, they all give these descriptions of like what's to come. And it's really, really interesting because you start to build this mental narrative of like how this is going to happen. And in Salvation, what I thought was really cool was that you're going into the future and you're seeing that these prophecies are coming true, and the characters have to kind of work to allow them to come true. So it's kind of a mirror of it. It's sort of like ring theory, I guess, kind of like the Star Wars, but done in a linear fashion, not like you start in the middle, go to the outside, and come back around. But it does share that sort of mirror image, kind of like ring theory in a way, in that the first three films, you're in the past, and they're trying to either work to stop the future from happening or accepting that it will happen. Whereas in the future, you're actually seeing a reflection of that. Like, just because Judgment Day has started, it doesn't mean that you have to stop worrying about what's to come, in regards to time travel. You're kind of actually in the past in a way, right? Because you've heard all these descriptions of what's to come, kind of like a story about the past. Because to Kyle Reese and the T-800 and all, it is the past. So it's a really, really interesting dynamic to me. It's a really cool idea. Again, I don't necessarily think that Salvation is not a very good movie. I acknowledge that. But I think that you could have made a movie that followed it that was really good. Maybe a couple or a few. I don't know. And in Terminator Genisys, even though it was only like 15 minutes, again, I think the future part is the coolest part. The time machine is really fucking cool to me. That's a cool fucking design. But to me, that should have been like the end of the series. That should have been like the final moment. Up until that point, you never actually see time. You never see a time traveler from their perspective going from like the future to the past. You never see the time travel actually occur. You see the end result of it, and then at the beginning of Terminator Genisys, you see the beginning result of it, and then it jumps back in time, and it kind of, for me, it kind of ruins the linearity of it. So my conception of the Terminator series as like a linear kind of ring theory type of deal was kind of destroyed with Terminator Genesis. Um, yeah, and they sort of kind of introduced alternate timelines too. This is something I've got to talk about as well because James Cameron mentioned that alternate timelines exist in the Terminator universe. Do they? I don't know. Genesis would seem to imply that they do, but I'm not so convinced. Okay, so like you think about Back to the Future, right? Back to the Future, it would seem like it's on an alternate timeline. Back to the Future 2 certainly implies that with the chalkboard scene, but I don't think it's really an alternate timeline in the conventional sense of the word. At least when I think of an alternate timeline, I think of fifth dimensional travel. Fourth dimensional being like past to present to future. Fourth dimensional being jumping between the same time, but between different timelines, which is not something you can do in the Back to the Future universe, in the Back to the Future logic. What Back to the Future is, I think, is more of, it's a single timeline that can be changed. It can be updated if you change stuff in the past. And there is, really fuzzy logic, to put it mildly, in Back to the Future on how time travel works, but basically that's it. You see a photograph, you change stuff in the past, that photograph will take time to update, but it will update. In the case of Terminator, I think that it's on kind of a similar timeline. Because here's the thing, a true alternate timeline, where you have multiple timelines that exist at once, I don't think that's the Terminator way, because if that were the case, why would the machines go back in time and try to change stuff in the past? Why would they try to terminate John Connor if that's just going to create a separate timeline that's not going to affect the one that they're on? They're on this one. They're trying to change stuff on timeline A. They go back in time and they create this alternate timeline. Well, on timeline B. Well, on timeline A, the machines still lose the war. So what's the point in going back in time if you're just going to create some ethereal timeline in another dimension? You're trying to change the one that you're on. That's the whole point of it. Okay? And same thing with the humans. Why are they going back in time to protect Sarah Connor or John Connor if this isn't going to affect them on timeline A? Do they really give a shit about the people on timeline B? See, I don't think that's a thing. I don't think there is a timeline A and B. I think there's just one timeline, and it updates if you change stuff in it in the past. Yes, the films are bad. Pretty bad. But they do contribute to the succession of the plot. And they do expand the franchise. Shrek the Third, that's a movie that you pretty much can cut out of the franchise and have it be okay. You can pretty much just watch Shrek, Shrek 2, and Shrek Forever After and have, like, a pretty solid trilogy. Shrek Forever After is not that great, but it's an okay conclusion. Shrek the Third. What happens in Shrek the Third that means anything? What happens that expands the universe? What, they go to a high school? The whole Frog King dying and then Artie taking over, that doesn't really need to happen. Because Shrek the Third invents the whole idea that the Frog King has to die. That wasn't said in Shrek 2. He didn't look like he was dying there. Shrek the Third also invents the idea of Charming as a primary villain. Right? That wasn't really in Shrek 2 either. In fact, Charming seems to join the party of the rest of the good guys at the end, basically. So, Shrek the Third, it doesn't really expand the world in any significant way. They just end up back in the swamp anyway. Babies, like, this is stuff that you could imply. Literally, Shrek Forever After summarizes the first three films, and the Shrek the Third thing that Rumpelstiltskin reads is just, oh yeah, and then they had ogre babies. You know, so it's like, and all the problems that Shrek the Third, all the solutions to problems, I should say, in Shrek the Third, they're all created within that film, right? So it's not like it addresses issues that needed addressing from other films. All of the problems and solutions are like in that one episode. It's actually kind of the most episodic Shrek film in a way. Another series I want to bring up that I really love a lot is the Kingdom Hearts video games. So this is a series that I love. Plenty of grievances with it too. But one thing I do love about it is that every entry into the franchise matters to some degree. Okay? Even terrible entries like Coded, so-so ones like Days, like, they do come back. There are references to them. It rewards you for playing through those games, for being a loyal player. And I wish that more movie franchises that had a lot of entries would reward you for being a loyal viewer. Why did I see the other 3 films? Why did I watch them? Why did I go to the theaters and pay to see Terminator Genesis if they're just going to kind of wipe it away? The Terminator films, again, I like the linearity to it. It does take us in a direction. It does move us forward up through Terminator 4 and up to the beginning of Terminator Genesis. I don't think it's helpful to erase that progression that's happened. That doesn't mean you have to hark on the earlier films, the 3, 4, and 5. That doesn't mean that you have to sing their praises or anything, but if there's something that has genuinely been contributed to the franchise, you don't have to toss that out just because the movies that made that contribution were bad. You can keep the contribution and move the story forward and make it good once more. I just want to see a progression of the story. And I don't feel like going back in time again and again and again really gives us that. This will be the 5th time that we go back in time, that we have the same scenario. It will be the 4th time that we have the specific scenario of a T-1000 or a similar model to the T-1000 liquid Terminator going back in time, trying to terminate them, and Arnold defending somebody. Can we not think of a different scenario? Can we really not? There are T-1s, like the big tanks and stuff, like there's a bunch of T's. You can look up Terminator wikis and stuff. There's all this other stuff. But they have to, because they're trying to appeal to a really general audience, they have to keep bringing back the same scenarios over and over again. It's like you can go beyond that. You realize? And a good sequel does go beyond that. I think there's other stuff, other directions that you could do. There's new things you could do with the series. But they keep this same scenario going over and over and over, and it's not interesting. And so, and I feel like it is one of the most stagnant series at this point. And there have been times where a director, where people, actors, directors, they've revisited franchises after a long period of time. And it hasn't gone over that well. Godfather 3, the Star Wars prequels. Having people who worked on the originals back doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to guarantee their success. Okay? Because when you've had that much of a gap between those films, people become very different when you give them a lot of time. They change, okay? And technology changes and businesses change. So I don't feel like actors, directors, anybody coming back necessarily guarantees the success, especially when you don't have one of the key elements, a couple of key elements, the writers and directors are not the same. That's pretty important there. Because you're a great actor, but you don't have the direction, you don't have the writing, kind of hard to give a good performance, even for the best of actors. Now we're talking about almost 30 years between Terminator 2 and Dark Fate. I have a feeling that people's expectations, if they're really expecting a Terminator 3, James Cameron style, that they're going to be disappointed if that's what they're looking for. So unless there's something explicit that tells us, okay, you know, Terminator 2 and Terminator Dark Fate couldn't have had 3, 4, and 5 in between them, I'm going to basically try to pretend like they did happen, that Dark Fate is a continuation of Terminator Genisys. And I think, again, unless there's something explicit in there, I think that it might be able to be done. Because Terminator Genisys, even though I don't like this plot point, it actually does set us back to the past. And because of that, we can kind of assume that the Linda Hamilton Sarah Connor in Terminator 6 could be a successor of like the alternate timeline Emilia Clarke one in Terminator 5. But regardless of whether it's considered as a whole in the Terminator franchise, or whether you consider it just a successor to Terminator 2, I'm going to try to watch this movie with an open heart and an open mind. Because I do hate remake culture. I really wish there would be more original ideas, but that doesn't mean that all remakes, reboots, sequels are bad. That's certainly not the case. You've got to give the film a chance to prove itself, and that's what I intend to do. I gotta say, I wish it would have gone in a different direction. But you can't judge something by how you wanted it to be. You've got to judge it by what it is. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to judge it as a movie on its own. So yeah, those were my very muddled and chaotic thoughts about the Terminator 6 trailer. Leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts on the trailer that you want to share. And with that, take care.